The sound of the gavel hung in the air like a thunderclap waiting to strike. Inside the dimly lit courtroom, every whisper was a dagger aimed at the man in shackles. Samuel Carter, an old black man with tired eyes and a body broken by decades of factory work, sat hunched at the defendant's table. The prosecutor's words still echoed, painting him as a thief, a liar, a man who had wasted his life and now deserved to waste away behind bars. Neighbors who once nodded politely on the street now muttered from the gallery, "I always knew he was hiding something. Look at him pretending to be a saint all those years." The venom stung sharper than the cold steel on his wrists. Samuel lowered his gaze, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his pain. The judge leaned forward, fingers tightening on the gavel. A life sentence hung on the edge of wood and silence. Samuel's breath grew shallow. For years, he had carried burdens without complaint, ridicule from his boss, hunger at his own table so 2 children could eat nights spent patching jackets with trembling hands. Yet none of that mattered now. In this room, truth had been twisted, and sacrifice had been rebranded as crime. And just as the gavel began its descent, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. 2 silhouettes stepped into the light, tall, steady, unshaken. The gallery stirred whispers cutting into gasps. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. He hadn't wanted them here. He had prayed they would never see him like this. But as the figures advanced down the aisle, their eyes fixed only on him, he realized something was about to shift. Not mercy, not pity, but revelation. The winter of that year cut deeper than most. Smoke from the steel mills clung to the air, mixing with the sharp sting of frost. Streets emptied quickly after dark. People hurried home with collars pulled high, eyes fixed on the ground, pretending not to notice whoever was left behind. Samuel Carter limped out of the factory gates, shoulders heavy, boots worn thin. At nearly 60, the limp he carried was a souvenir from decades of hard labor, one that never healed and never earned sympathy. His boss, Mr. Harlan, had spat the same words at him that afternoon. Too slow. Too useless. "You're lucky you've still got a job." Samuel swallowed the insult like he always did, lowering his head, gripping the straps of his patched coat tighter against the wind. As he passed the narrow alley behind a diner, a sound tugged at him, not a voice, but the hum of freezer fans blending with the winter's whistle. There, half hidden by the shadow of a dumpster, 2 children huddled together. Their skin pale, their lips trembling blue. The boy, no more than 10, had wrapped a thin arm around his sister, shielding her with a kind of desperation that broke Samuel's heart. Their clothes were scraps layered on bones, hardly more protection than paper. He froze. For a moment, he considered doing what everyone else had done, keep walking. His boss's voice rang in his ears again. "Don't waste time on strays. You can barely feed yourself." And Harlan wasn't wrong. Samuel's meals were often little more than leftovers, his apartment barely warmer than the streets. But as the children looked up, eyes wide and far too old for their age, something stronger than hunger pulled him down to his knees. His joints ached as he crouched. "You 2 got anywhere to go?" he asked softly. Silence. Just a slow shake of the head. Samuel exhaled his breath, fogging in the bitter air. He knew what it felt like to be discarded, to be invisible. And he couldn't leave them there. Not tonight. He extended a calloused hand. The boy hesitated, but then the girl's tiny fingers slipped into his palm, ice cold yet trusting, and with that fragile grip, something unspoken was sealed. By the time Samuel Carter led the children out of that frozen alley, night had swallowed the town. The boy clutched his sister's hand, both trailing behind him like fragile shadows. Their steps echoed in the stairwell of Samuel's crumbling apartment building where peeling paint curled like old scabs and the air smelled of damp concrete. Doors cracked open as neighbors peeked out. Whispers slithered through the hall. "Look at that fool," one man muttered. "Can't even pay his own bills now he's dragging strays inside." A woman shook her head, voice dripping with scorn. "He'll sink with them. Mark my words." Samuel heard every word. He always did. But he didn't flinch, didn't answer. He simply kept walking, shoulders bent against judgment heavier than the winter wind. Inside his apartment was no palace wallpaper peeling, couch sagging under its own weight, a single heater rattling louder than it warmed. Yet for the children, it was a world apart from the frozen street. Samuel rummaged through his small cupboard hands, stiff as he found a can of broth. He warmed it slowly, setting it before them. The boy ate with trembling urgency, spoon clattering against the bowl. The girl's tiny hands wrapped around the mug like it was fire itself. Samuel watched in silence, his own stomach empty, but his heart carrying a strange fullness he hadn't felt in years. Later that night, he laid thin blankets across the couch, guiding them gently to sleep. He sat in the corner, rubbing his aching leg eyes, heavy but unyielding. Tomorrow he knew his boss would mock him again. Tomorrow money would stretch thinner than ever. But tonight 2 children were not sleeping on frozen concrete. That was enough. As the heater coughed its weak warmth, Samuel whispered to himself, words no one else would hear. "They'll never be left behind again. Not as long as I'm alive." And with that quiet vow, a bond was forged, one the world dismissed as foolish, but one that would outlast every sneer and every cold night to come. The days that followed were anything but gentle. At the steel factory, the air reeked of burnt iron, each clang of machinery shaking Samuel Carter's weary bones. His limp slowed him down, but never stopped him. Still, Mr. Harlan made sure the entire floor was reminded of Samuel's uselessness. "Carter," his voice boomed across the hall. "Even those orphans you dragged home probably move faster than you." Laughter rippled through the factory. Some workers chuckled nervously, eager to please the boss. Others shifted uncomfortably ashamed, but silent. Samuel simply wiped the sweat from his brow and kept moving, each insult sinking into his shoulders like fresh iron weights. When the whistle blew and his shift ended, Samuel limped back to his building, the echoes of ridicule trailing him like shadows. But the moment his door creaked open, the heaviness lifted. 2 small figures ran toward him, their laughter colliding in the cramped space. Eli, the boy, always had a book clutched tight, eager to read aloud the new words he had learned. Grace, his little sister, sat at the wobbly table with a dull pencil sketching houses brighter than anything they had ever lived in. Samuel's chest swelled with quiet pride as he listened, nodding, encouraging. When cupboards ran thin, Samuel gave them his share, hiding his hunger behind a gentle smile. He patched Eli's jacket with clumsy stitches, saved coins for Grace's shoes, and when the heater sputtered and died, he pulled them close beneath his own blanket. The neighbors whispered in stairwells. "He'll end up on the street with them," one woman muttered. "A black man raising 2 white kids. They'll turn on him the first chance they get," another smirked. Samuel heard. He always heard. But instead of answering, he poured himself into the children. He taught Eli how to change a tire, how to shake a hand with dignity. He showed Grace how to balance coins, how to stand tall even when the world tried to shrink her. And though the world doubted Samuel believed in one thing, kindness wasn't weakness. It was seed quietly taking root in the soil of 2 young lives. It happened on a gray morning when the factory smoke hung heavier than usual. Samuel Carter stood in Mr. Harlan's office, cap in hand, voice low but steady. "Sir Grace hasn't been well. I need a day to take her to the clinic." Harlan leaned back, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. "Grace," he sneered. "You mean that little stray you picked up? You're not her father. Stop playing hero and get back to work." Samuel's jaw tightened. For years he had bitten down his pride, but this time he did not back away. "She needs me," he said quietly. And with that he turned and left the office, knowing exactly what it would cost. That afternoon, instead of standing on the factory floor, Samuel walked hand in hand with Grace down the cracked sidewalks of town. The clinic was small, the wait long, but he sat with her patiently, his calloused thumb tracing comfort against her tiny palm. When the doctor finally called them in, relief washed over him. Grace would be fine, just a fever medicine and rest. Nothing his love couldn't weather. But love had its price. That night, Samuel opened his pay slip with trembling hands, half his wages gone, docked without mercy. He folded the slip quietly and tucked it into his pocket before Eli or Grace could see. At dinner, he ladled broth into their bowls, keeping only a crust of bread for himself, his smile steady as if nothing had changed. The neighbors noticed the wear in his clothes, the way his boots thinned faster each season. "He'll starve himself for them," one muttered at the corner store. Another shook his head. "Madness. Pure madness." Yet in the apartment, madness looked like devotion. Samuel listened as Eli read aloud from a borrowed book, his voice confident, strong. He watched Grace sketch houses with roofs that didn't leak, doors that always opened. And though his stomach gnawed and his body bent lower under the weight of sacrifice, Samuel felt something grow taller in the room, hope. Because while Harlan thought he was cutting Samuel down, Samuel knew he was building something that no payslip could measure. Years slipped by like pages torn from a book. Samuel Carter's hair thinned, his back bent lower each season, and his limp grew heavier with every winter. Yet inside the peeling walls of his apartment, life was blooming. Eli, once the quiet boy clutching a tattered book, grew into a sharp young man with eyes bright as steel. His grades drew whispers from teachers who said a factory worker's orphan had no place excelling like this. But scholarships began to arrive one after another. Samuel pinned each letter to the wall as though they were gold. Grace, the little girl who once drew houses with broken pencils, now stood tall in debate halls, her voice fierce and unafraid. She challenged anyone who mocked her family, her words slicing sharper than Samuel's silence ever could. Neighbors who had once whispered cruelties found themselves silenced when they passed. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others in reluctant respect. But Samuel never gloated. He simply watched from his corner chair, pride swelling in his chest, even as his body sagged under the weight of years. Each evening he returned home from the factory, slower, his hands rough as stone. Yet when Eli read aloud his essays, or Grace waved a ribbon from a school competition, Samuel felt lighter. Maybe kindness wasn't wasted after all. Maybe every empty meal, every long shift had been planting seeds, and now he was watching them bloom. But not everyone shared his joy. From the factory floor, Mr. Harlan watched too. He watched Samuel walk a little taller despite his limp. Watched the orphans he had mocked turn into something remarkable. With each scholarship letter, with each achievement, bitterness gnawed at him deeper. How does a man like Carter, broken and pitiful, deserve this dignity he spat to a foreman one morning? The words curdled in his mouth, tasting of envy and hate. While Samuel built a family out of scraps, Harlan's spike grew sharper than any blade. And though Samuel could not see it, a trap was quietly taking shape, one meant to crush not only his pride, but everything he had built. It was an autumn morning when the knock came. Sharp, unforgiving. Samuel Carter opened his door to find two policemen standing stiff in crisp uniforms, their eyes cold as winter glass. "Mr. Carter," one said flatly, "we need to look inside." Before Samuel could ask why they pushed past him, boots thudding across the worn floorboards. His modest apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the sagging couch, the heater that rattled but never truly warmed became a stage for violation. Samuel's chest tightened as drawers were yanked open, cushions tossed aside. And then came the moment. One officer pulled up a cushion from the couch and revealed a bag stuffed with cash and company equipment stamped with the factory's label. Samuel froze his breath, catching in his throat. He had never seen it before. The officer's expression never shifted. "You're under arrest." Cold steel closed around Samuel's wrists, biting into skin already scarred from years of labor. From the stairwell above, neighbors gathered, whispering like vultures circling fresh prey. "Knew it," one muttered. "Always said he'd end up in trouble," another smirked. Samuel's heart sank further as he was led outside. And there, waiting at the factory gates, stood Mr. Harlan. Arms folded, a grin stretched wide across his face. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all." He sneered loud enough for the workers to hear. A few laughed, eager to align themselves with power. Others turned away, shame pulling at their faces. But no one stepped forward. No one spoke for Samuel. The patrol car door slammed shut, and with it the world Samuel had built from sacrifice began to splinter. His neighbors saw not the man who had patched jackets with clumsy stitches, nor the father who had skipped meals so children could eat. They saw only what Harlan wanted them to see, a criminal broken and caught. As the car pulled away, Samuel closed his eyes, silence heavy in his chest. He knew the truth, but in a world twisted by cruelty and prejudice, the truth had never been enough. The courtroom smelled of varnish and dust, its benches filled with curious faces hungry for scandal. Samuel Carter sat hunched at the defendant's table, his once broad shoulders now sagging beneath years of labor and humiliation. His wrists bore the faint red lines of shackles recently removed, and his eyes, though weary, held a flicker of disbelief. The prosecutor paced with theatrical precision, voice sharp as a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not a hero, not a saint, but a bitter old man who stole to survive. A man who hid behind the mask of charity while quietly taking what was never his." Each word struck like hammer blows. Samuel wanted to stand to scream, but decades of swallowing insults had trained him into silence. His hands clenched under the table, knuckles white. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Workers from the factory men Samuel had shared shifts and sweat with claimed they had seen him sneaking around storage rooms. Their eyes darted, their voices uncertain, but the lies rolled out smooth, rehearsed. Samuel knew Harlan's money had greased those tongues, but knowing and proving were oceans apart. From the gallery came whispers sharp enough to cut. "I knew he was too good to be true. Those kids he raised, bet they don't even know who he really is." Samuel's chest tightened. Eli and Grace. He hadn't wanted them here. He couldn't bear the thought of them watching him crumble under this storm. Better they stayed away, far from this shame. The judge's gavel struck, once the sound echoing like a death knell. "Mr. Carter faces a possible life sentence," the voice declared, heavy with finality. The walls seemed to close in the air, growing thin. Samuel's gaze dropped to the floor, a single thought pressing down like iron. Maybe Harlan was right. Maybe a man like me was never meant to rise above his place. And then, just as despair threatened to consume him whole, the heavy doors at the back creaked open. 2 figures entered their steps, firm, their presence undeniable. The room stirred, whispers rising into gasps. For the first time in years, Samuel's heart dared to beat with something he thought long buried. The heavy courtroom doors shut behind them with a final thud, and every head turned. 2 figures strode down the aisle, no longer the shivering children Samuel had once lifted from a frozen alley, but adults shaped by his sacrifices. Eli Carter, tall and steady, carried a stack of thick legal files tucked under one arm. His tie was straight, his gaze unflinching. Beside him, Grace moved with quiet determination, a small recorder flashing red in her hand, her eyes scanning every face in the gallery. The whispers swelled into a low roar. Are those his kids? Impossible. Look at them. They don't belong to him. But disbelief quickly gave way to silence as Eli stopped at the defense table, his voice ringing clear. Your Honor, my name is Eli Carter. I stand before you today as counsel for the defense. He set the files down with a sharp thud, the sound echoing like a challenge across the chamber. Samuel's breath caught. His eyes stung with disbelief. The timid boy who once clung to scraps of books now stood as his advocate, unshaken before the very system that sought to bury him. Grace slipped into a seat near the gallery, her recorder steady. She wasn't just there to watch. She was documenting every word, every lie, every crack in the facade. Her articles had already rattled powerful names, and now her pen was aimed squarely at Harlan. Harlan's smirk faltered for the first time, his jaw tightening as he shifted in his seat. He hadn't counted on this. He thought Samuel's children would vanish ashamed of their broken guardian. Instead, they had returned carrying weapons he never imagined, the law and the truth. Samuel's heart pounded a mix of pride and fear. He had wanted to shield them from his shame, but now he realized they hadn't come out of pity. They had come because his kindness had grown roots deep and unshakable, and it was time for them to fight for him as he once fought for them. And for the first time in that suffocating courtroom, hope stirred like fire catching dry wood. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Eli stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "The prosecution claims my father stole from the factory. Let us examine that." He opened the first file pages, rustling like a storm about to break. "Witness number 1, you testified that you saw Samuel Carter sneaking into storage." The man on the stand shifted nervously. Eli's gaze pinned him in place. "Did you see him, or did you hear rumors?" he pressed. Silence stretched, then a stammer. I only heard." Gasps rippled through the room. Eli moved to the next. "Witness number 2, you claim to have caught Mr. Carter red-handed. Yet here in your earlier statement, you said you weren't even working that night." He held up the document, the contradiction glaring under the courtroom lights. The witness faltered, sweat beading at his brow. One by one, Eli sliced through their lies, exposing cracks with surgical precision. Years of study had sharpened him into a weapon, and now he wielded it with deadly calm. Harlan shifted uncomfortably, his smug expression fading. He leaned forward, fists clenching white on the table. And then Grace rose. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, clear. "I have a report to submit." She held up a folder thick with documents. "It details Mr. Harlan's history of wage theft, harassment, and falsified accounts at the factory. These records were obtained through months of investigative journalism. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously as Grace's words cut through the haze. Her recorder flashed red, capturing every tremor, every reaction. Harlan's face flushed crimson. "This is irrelevant," he barked, but the panic in his tone betrayed him. The judge tapped his pen, eyes narrowing. "Irrelevant or inconvenient." His gaze lingered on Harlan, then turned back to the stack of evidence growing against him. Samuel sat, frozen tears blurring his vision. He had thought his sacrifices went unnoticed, but here they were, his children armed with law and truth, turning the tide he thought irreversible. For the first time in decades, the man once mocked as useless sat a little taller. Because in that moment, Samuel Carter was no longer on trial. Harlan was. The courtroom had become a storm. Murmurs rolled like thunder as evidence stacked higher against Mr. Harlan. Every document Grace unveiled, every contradiction Eli exposed, pulled another thread from the prosecution's case. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the bench, his eyes sharp with calculation. Finally, his voice broke through the chaos, low, but carrying across the chamber. "It seems this entire case was built on manipulation." Gasps rippled. The prosecutor blanched, fumbling with his notes. Harlan surged to his feet, his voice rising. "This is absurd. He's a thief. He's enough." The judge cut him off his gavel, striking once. The sound cracked like lightning. "The charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the room erupted applause from the gallery, shouts of vindication, a few jeers thrown like stones at Harlan as he stormed toward the exit. His face burned crimson, his power stripped bare in front of the very people he once ruled with fear. Samuel sat motionless, his breath caught in his chest. He blinked against the sting in his eyes, hardly able to comprehend the words that had just freed him. For so long he had prepared himself to carry chains until death. Now the weight was gone, lifted by the very children he once carried from a frozen alley. Eli placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder, grounding him back to the moment. Grace slipped beside him, her voice breaking into a whisper that cut deeper than any gavel strike. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word Dad echoed louder than the judge's decree. Samuel's back, long bent under years of labor and shame, straightened at last. His eyes rose to meet the world no longer in defeat, but in defiance. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as neighbors who once mocked fell into stunned silence. The man they had dismissed as foolish, pitiful, disposable had just been lifted higher than any of them could have imagined. And for the first time in decades, Samuel Carter was free, not just from the charges, but from the cage of invisibility the world had built around him. When the gavel's echo faded and the crowd began to disperse, Samuel Carter sat in stillness, his hands trembling on the table before him. Freedom felt foreign, like a coat borrowed, but not yet worn in. Yet as Eli's steady hand rested on his shoulder and Grace's whisper lingered in his ear, something long buried stirred within him. He remembered the night decades earlier, the bitter wind, the alley's shadows, and 2 children shivering by a dumpster. He had reached out with nothing to give but his calloused hand whispering, "Not tonight." That fragile choice, dismissed by neighbors as madness, had grown into the very force that now lifted him from the brink of ruin. Reporters crowded close, pens scratching, cameras flashing, but Samuel barely noticed. What mattered was that the children he once saved had returned not as orphans in need, but as warriors armed with truth and courage. He had once carried them out of the cold. Tonight they had carried him out of a cage. Outside the courthouse, neighbors who once sneered stood silent. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others clapped awkwardly, unsure how to reconcile the man they had mocked with the dignity now shining from him. Samuel did not gloat. He simply straightened his back, meeting the world at eye level for the first time in years. Because kindness does not die. It waits. It grows. And when the time is right, it saves. Samuel Carter's story is not just about injustice or redemption. It is a reminder. Every act of compassion plants a seed, one that may take years, even decades to bloom. But when it does, its branches can shield us in ways we never imagined. So if this story has moved, you don't let it end here. Share it with a friend. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if it's your first time with us, hit that subscribe button because we have more stories of justice, sacrifice, and redemption waiting for you. This isn't the last time you'll see kindness win.